women. There are hardly any colleges for women, and no university will admit you, will allow you to even sit on the lawn. So, she concludes chapter 1 with the urbanity. Let's have the slide again. The urbanity, the geniality, and the dignity, which are the offspring of luxury and privacy and space. The effect of poverty on the mind, and particularly the effect of tradition and of the lack of tradition upon the mind of a writer. Libraries need money. They need endowments. People have to give money. But when women do not earn, which woman is going to give money? And therefore, she says, at the thought of all those women working year after year and finding it hard to get £2,000 together, and as much as they could to get £30,000, we burst out in scorn at the reprehensible poverty of our sex, because we don't have money. Only if Mrs. Satan and her like had gone into business at the age of 15, there would have been, what was the snag in that argument? She says, no Mary. And therefore, she realizes as she walks back to the inn, I pondered why it was that Mrs. Satan had no money to leave us, and what effect poverty has on the mind. And I thought how unpleasant it is to be locked out. And I thought how it is worse perhaps to be locked in. And thinking of the safety and poverty and safety and prosperity of the one sex, and the poverty and insecurity of the other, and of the effect of tradition and of the lack of tradition upon the mind of a writer. 1,000 stars were flashing across the blue wastes of the sky. All human beings were laid asleep. Nobody seemed stirring in the streets of Oxbridge. The first chapter, my dear students, ends on a very, very sad note. And that brings me to chapter 2. Chapter 2, the scene moves from Oxbridge, from the university area, to London. And she says, Mary Seton tells the readers, Virginia Woolf probably told her listeners, the scene, if I may ask you to follow me, was now changed. The leaves were still falling, but in London now, not Oxbridge. And I must ask you to imagine a room, like many thousands, with a window looking across people's hats, and vans and motor cars to other windows, and on the table inside the room, a blank sheet of paper on which was written in large letters, Women and Fiction. The inevitable sequel to lunching and dining at Oxbridge seemed unfortunately to be a visit to the British Museum. Remember, the British Museum is one of the biggest libraries in England. What must we do in order to be able to write on women in fiction? Remember, that is the thesis with which the book began, with which chapter 1 began. One must strain off what was personal and accidental in all these impressions, and so reach the pure fluid, the essential oil of truth. Suddenly, she comes to the question that can we write? Can there be women writing fiction if, number one, there is no economic independence, and two, if there is no universal suffragette? Have you heard the word suffragette? And do you know what the phrase universal suffragette means? The right to vote. We are lucky, we Indians are lucky, that when our men got the right to vote, the women also got. So we did not have to fight for the woman's right to vote. Whereas, my dear students, you may be surprised to know that in many countries of the world, many countries that today we call first world countries, countries we call the developed countries of the world, the women did not get the right to vote as soon as their men got it. They had to fight for it. And when every adult can vote in a country, we call it the universal suffragette. So you could go back and check on what and when the British women got the right to vote. Let me read from chapter 2, page 28. Have you any notion how many are written by men? Are you aware that you are perhaps the most discussed animal in the universe? She's talking about women. Here had I come with a notebook and a pencil, proposing to spend a morning reading, supposing that at the end of the morning I would have transferred the truth to my notebook. No, I would need claws of steel and beak of brass even to penetrate the husk. I asked myself in despair and began running my eye up and down the long list of titles. Even the names of books gave me food for thought. Sex and its nature might well attract doctors and biologists, but what was surprising and difficult of explanation was the fact that sex, women that is to say, also attracts agreeable essayists, light-fingered novelists, young men who have taken the MA degree, men who have taken no degree, men who have no apparent qualification save that they are not women. What she is saying is that there are so many books on women. And when she started looking for books on men, she found that there were hardly any. What could be the reason of this curious disparity? I wondered. Why are women, judging from this catalogue, so much more interesting to men than men are to women? My mind wandered to picture the lives of men who spend their time in writing books about women. The passages that I read for you now are from page 28 and 29 of my edition of A Room of One's Own. But you could go back and look at your own edition and try and read those passages. She then asks us questions. Why did men drink wine and women water? Why was one sex so prosperous and the other so poor? What effect has poverty on fiction? What conditions are necessary for the creation of works on art? And then she says, but while I pondered, I had unconsciously, in my listlessness, in my desperation, been drawing a picture where I should, like my neighbor, have been writing a conclusion. I had drawn a face, a figure. It was the face and the figure of Professor Von X, imaginary, engaged in writing his monumental work titled The Mental, Moral, and Physical Inferiority of the Female Sex. He was not, in my picture, a man attractive to women. He was heavily built, etc., etc. His expression suggested that he was laboring under some emotion. How did he use the pen? He kept jabbing on the pen, as if he were killing some noxious insect as he wrote. Was the picture of a cavalry officer, slim and elegant? Whatever maybe the reason, the professor was made to look very angry and very ugly in my sketch as he wrote this great monumental work. Let me quickly take you on to the conclusion of this chapter. I'm reading from page 41 of my book. Moreover, in 100 years, I thought, reaching my own doorstep, women will have ceased to be the protected sex. 100 years, she says. Logically, they will take part in all the activities and exertions that once they were denied. They would be probably less protected. Remove that protection, expose them to the same exertions and activities, make them soldiers and sailors and engine drivers and dock laborers. And then she says, maybe I will be able to write my chapter, Women and Fiction. that brings me to chapter 3. She says, it would have been impossible completely and entirely for any woman to have written the plays of Shakespeare. She talks about the concept of strong women in literature. Remember, Ruskin had said Shakespeare has no heroes, only heroines. But here, she goes to Professor Trevelyan and says, Professor Trevelyan concludes, neither Shakespeare's women, I'm reading from page 44 of chapter 3, nor those of authentic 17th century memoirs seem wanting in personality and character. Certainly, if we consider it, and these are some of the strong women in literature, Cleopatra must have had a way with her. Lady Macbeth, one would suppose, had a will of her own. Rosalind, one might conclude, was an attractive girl. Not being a historian, she says, one might go even further and say that women have burnt like beacons in all the works of all the poets from the beginning of time. Clytemnestra, Antigone, Cleopatra, Lady Macbeth, Phaedra, Cressida, Rosalind, Desdemona, the Duchess of Malfi, and among others, Millamant, Clarissa, Becky Sharp, Anna Karenina, Emma Bovary, Madame de Gormatis. My dear students, that's quite a list. And if you have to find out where these characters come from, you'll have to go to the book, read page 44, and see what Virginia Woolf is telling us. And this is where we come to that interesting story I told you about Will Shakespeare's sister Judith. Let me again remind you that this is a figment of Virginia Woolf's imagination. But what she's telling us is, just imagine for a moment, imagine that William Shakespeare did have a sister. Her name, let us assume, was Judith. And she was, remember, as well endowed, as talented, as great as Shakespeare. But why haven't we heard of her? Because where would she sit and write? There was a common sitting room, and therefore she got no privacy. In fact, she draws our attention to the fact that even Jane Austen, who was writing much later, probably covered her writing, imagine, with a blotting paper, because she did not want anyone to see what she was writing. So assuming that Shakespeare did have a sister, Judith, even if she did attempt to write, there was no way any of her writing would have come down to us. Let's look at the slide now, where he talks about Judith Shakespeare. And Woolf tells us, Virginia Woolf tells us, let's look at the slide. Here am I asking why women did not write poetry in the Elizabethan age. And I'm not sure how they were educated, whether they were taught to write, whether they had sitting rooms to themselves, how many women had children before they were 21, what, in short, they did from 8 in the morning till 8 at night. So, we really don't know what and how they lived. How could we ever imagine that they would be writing? That brings me to chapter 4, where she begins by quickly looking at some of the earliest women writers. She draws our attention to the fact that the early women writers were actually aristocrats. They probably had spare time. They had spare money. They had a room of their own, maybe. And so they started writing. One of the earliest writers that she talks about is Lady Winchelsea, born in 1661. They wrote poetry. And then she comes on to later writers like Afra Ben, you might have come across her name somewhere, who began writing literature which comes from the middle class. Afra Ben was married. Afra Ben was not an aristocrat, and yet she wrote. To return to Afra Ben, she proved that money could be made by writing, perhaps writing of certain agreeable qualities. And so she talks about some of those writers. They wrote, probably sitting in their common sitting room. And then she makes a point that probably it is easier to write fiction. Why is it easier to write fiction? Virginia Woolf comes to the conclusion, I don't know, that's her conclusion, that it needs less concentration. Writing a play needs more concentration. Writing poetry needs more imagination. And that is why she says the early women writers wrote more of fiction and less of drama and poetry. I do not know on what she bases this, but she gives examples of Jane Austen and Charlotte Bronte. You have read or heard of, I'm sure, Jane Austen, Pride and Prejudice, Sense and Sensibility, Mansfield Park, Emma, Persuasion, Northanger Abbey. You know these important novels. You've also heard of Charlotte Bronte, of course, and Jane Eyre. So she says women see and feel and value differently than men. And that because of this, they must also write differently. Very quickly, let us move on to chapter 5, where we have another interesting character, Mary Carmichael. She says, let's look at the writings of Mary Carmichael. Now, let me remind you, she uses Mary Carmichael as an example, my dear students, but there is no Mary Carmichael. Again, an imaginary writer. So she talks about what kind of writing Mary Carmichael would have done. Virginia Woolf is full of praise for Jane Austen as well as Charlotte Bronte. That brings me to chapter 6, where the fictional narrator looks at her empty page. The essay titled Women and Fiction Are Still Unwritten. And then the fictional narrator disappears and Virginia Woolf talks to us. And what does she say? Intellectual freedom depends upon material things. Poetry depends upon intellectual freedom. And women have always been poor, not for 200 years merely, but from the beginning of time. Women then have not had a dog's chance of writing poetry. That is why I have laid so much stress on money and a room of one's own. Remember,